Thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. We are going to talk about how decarbonising shipping and aviation will boost UK green growth. I'm going to do a very short intro, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nuala, who's going to give us the policy updates. And there are actually policy updates on aviation shipping, which is not always the case. And then we're going to have our three great panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to go straight into Q&A. So just to tee up the panelists for now, we have Scott Pendry from Cranfield Aerospace Solutions. We have Maria Nelson from the Aerospace Technology Institute, and Peter Aylott from the UK Chamber of Shipping. So it should be a really exciting Q&A. And there is a button there that you guys can put your own questions in as we go through. So if you think of any, you may already have questions, please go ahead and put them in and we can put them to the panelists. And if you want to tweet or LinkedIn about this webinar, please go ahead. You can see our tags there for the SASHA Coalition. And we'll be recording this webinar, and you'll be able to, I think we'll send it around to everyone afterwards and also put it on our website. So with that, suffice to say, I will give you an intro to the SASHA Coalition, which is the Skies and Seas Hydrogen Fuels Accelerator Coalition. And basically what we are doing is bringing together the shipping and aviation industries to really call for solutions that actually have the greatest emission reduction potential in both sectors. And those are really green hydrogen derived. At the same time, there are very limited supplies of green hydrogen at the moment. And those are not always directed towards the sectors that need the most, such as shipping and aviation. Shipping and aviation are two global sectors, obviously. And while we're focusing here today on UK policy, actually, as a little spoiler, we're going to have an EU-focused webinar later this year in August. So we'll make sure you all get an invite. But those limited supplies of green hydrogen are not always directed to those sectors that need them most. And so the SASHA Coalition is here to try and remedy that and actually bring the voice of those global sectors in front of policymakers who don't always have them kind of front of mind. But we are up to our first birthday now. We launched last May, which was a really exciting webinar with Laura Deben. And if you want to go to the next slide, actually. In addition to that, we have produced the Green Hydrogen Gap, which is a report kind of detailing that hydrogen gap that I spoke about for shipping and aviation, which was based on supporting research from Arup. We've got a number of different fact sheets, just laying out what the different fuels are for shipping and aviation, which Nuala will speak to a lot more. And they also go into the policy that exists to date, which is not really sufficient. And then just the final thing I'm going to say before I pass to Nuala is just on our membership. We have 7 members there, as you can see. I'm not going to go through all of them or what they do. They're on our website, so you can have a look and click through to the different organizations. But obviously we have Scott from Cranfield Aerospace Solutions, who is a member today and who we'll hear from later. So with that, I will hand over to Nuala.
Great, thanks very much, Aoife. So I'm going to speak very briefly on 3 topics that will provide a short introduction to this webinar. So firstly, why we're talking about green hydrogen derived fuels in the first place, where the intersection between decarbonising shipping and aviation lies in the UK with green growth, and finally, what the UK policy context is around the use of green hydrogen fuels for decarbonising shipping and aviation. So we're just going to begin with the role of green hydrogen and green hydrogen derived fuels. They're a key driver for decarbonisation in this sector. So last year, we commissioned Arup to undertake some research into the different fuel production pathways for sustainable fuels for shipping and aviation, and where green hydrogen comes into play. And they actually found that all pathways for sustainable fuels require hydrogen to a greater or lesser extent if we exclude that direct electrification pathway. Obviously, if we're going to maximise emissions reductions, this must be the hydrogen itself with the lowest emissions, which is renewable hydrogen, is produced using renewable electricity via electrolysis, and we'll be referring to this as green hydrogen. So this slide gives a slightly more detailed visualization of the fuel production pathways for aviation. If we follow that green hydrogen line, we can see it feeding into all the pathways bar direct electrification. And we can also see that different fuel production pathways have different feedstocks. And obviously these different feedstocks have different climate impacts over their full lifetime and also different constraints on their availability. So if we look at those sustainable aviation fuels, if we take hydroprocessed ester and fatty acids, the waste oils and fats that they are made from are already in high demand from other sectors, such as road transportation, for their own decarbonisation. We also see greater emission reduction potential coming from fuels produced using green hydrogen and a renewable source of carbon, such as that captured using direct air capture, compared to other forms of SAF. So although if these fuels are to be rolled out at scale, we're going to need to see a significant increase in both the renewable electricity feedstock used to produce them, electrolyser capacity to produce the green hydrogen, and ultimately e-fuel production facilities too. Now, when we look at fuel production pathways for shipping, the story is much the same. With green hydrogen, it can either be used directly as a fuel to make ammonia or methanol. And all of these pathways require green hydrogen. Like with some SAFs, methanol can be produced using either a biogenic source of carbon or carbon captured directly from the air. And again, while direct air capture is a technology that must be scaled significantly, we see issues with the use of biofuels due to that limited supply. So just before looking at what current regulations are doing to support the development of green hydrogen fuels and how they can be strengthened, I'm just going to briefly outline how developing these technologies can both reduce emissions and bring about wider benefits. So we know that UK shipping and aviation contribute hugely to total emissions in the country, and civil aviation alone represented 8% of UK emissions in 2019. But they also do play a big role economically. There are huge numbers of jobs supported by the industries, and UK aviation shipping both have significant importance globally. Because of how established both industries are in the UK and the R&D environment and companies already based here, there's a real opportunity for competitive advantage in developing the future technologies that will decarbonise shipping and aviation, and therefore providing a real green growth opportunity across the country. Green hydrogen production is also a potential opportunity for the UK itself. And it's something that the government is keen to see play a big part in the UK's future energy aspirations. So far, 400 million has been invested in 11 new green hydrogen projects. We're going to see more projects coming up as the government seeks to achieve its target for 10 gigawatts of hydrogen production by 2030. So now we looked at the options available to the shipping and aviation industries and the associated green growth opportunity of transitioning towards them. Let's look at the current regulations promoting the uptake of green hydrogen derived fuels. So for aviation, the UK Jet Zero strategy guides the government's approach to the sector's decarbonisation. So how is it doing that? So firstly, the government is introducing a SAF mandate from 2025, which will set the minimum amount of sustainable aviation fuels that producers will have to use in any given year from 2025 to 2040 currently, and also the price they'll pay for not complying with this mandate. The mandate itself does currently lack ambition to drive the production and use of the most sustainable fuels in the UK. It only requires 22% of jet fuel to be sustainable by 2040. And for the same year, only 3.5% of fuel to come from the lowest emission form of SAF, which is e-fuels. Crucially, both the overall mandate and the e-fuel sub-mandate does sit at a lower level than the EU equivalent. So ideally, we want to see that level of ambition at least matched, if not exceeded. Production of sustainable aviation fuels in the UK is also going to be supported by the introduction of a revenue certainty mechanism. And the government is currently consulting on how that mechanism will be introduced. This tool really needs to focus its support on the production of e-fuels, which are currently at an earlier stage of development than other SAFs, and they're also going to come at higher costs. So really should be the focus of any such mechanism. And finally, for aviation, zero emission flight is being supported through the Jet Zero Council's Zero Emission Flight Delivery Group and investment in R&D. And I'm sure we're going to be hearing much more from our panelists on this topic specifically. When we turn to shipping, the Clean Maritime Plan provides the overarching strategy for the sector's decarbonisation in the UK, and we are expecting an update to this document very soon. The plan acknowledges that the vast majority of emission reductions will come from switching to low or zero emission fuels, and we really want to see that statement accompanied by a regulatory framework for the uptake of these fuels. And finally, last year, we saw the international regulator for shipping, the International Maritime Organization, set a target of achieving net zero emissions in the sector by 2050. And crucially for zero emission fuels, this included a statement for those to be part of this through a target of striving for 10% uptake of zero or near zero emission technologies, fuels, or other energy sources by 2030. So for us at the SASHA Coalition, what do we think needs to change? So we want to see underpinning all actions the need for cross-departmental coordination on aviation and shipping decarbonisation, ensuring that transport stakeholders are involved in decision-making on future uses of green hydrogen and DAC. We also want to see stronger regulations to incentivise the use of fuels with the greatest emission reduction potential, so those green hydrogen fuels over those with less emission reduction potential. Hydrogen strategies should also make clear that green hydrogen should be prioritised for use in sectors that don't have alternatives. And finally, want to see that alignment of aviation and shipping decarbonisation policy with levelling up strategies. So looking forward to hearing more about that today. So that kind of concludes a very brief policy overview. So I'll now pass back to Aoife and our panellists to discuss it further. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nuala. So yeah, I briefly introduced our panelists earlier, and you can see there are excellent group of panelists. But now I'm going to give them all a chance to introduce themselves. So just, I guess, in the order that they're there, Scott of Cranfield Aerospace Solutions, would you like to tell us a bit about what you do?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I think SASHA is going to play a really important role, certainly when it comes to policy debates and leverage the collective positions of the many members that you are now have. So a bit of background to Cranfield Aerospace Solutions, for those who don't know. So spin out from Cranfield University. The company's been around for about 30 years, but it was around about 3.5 years ago that the company decided to use all of the skills and competencies and experience that it had done for those last 30 years and put it towards developing solutions for sustainable aviation. And in short, we've now developed a zero emissions hydrogen fuel cell powered propulsion system for a range of applications and platforms. The initial product is the Britten-Norman Islander aircraft, a 9-seat small regional aircraft. The idea is that we'll scale up that propulsion system and indeed scale down as well for different applications. Hydrogen will allow the complete elimination of CO2 emissions in flight and along the entire energy life cycle, if, and it is a big if, produced from renewable sources. So a little bit on, why hydrogen? Well, first, relative to sustainable aviation fuels and indeed jet fuel, using hydrogen reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And in the case of fuel cell propulsion, it is a true zero solution. The emissions are limited to small amounts of water vapor, a byproduct of the energy production process. And just very briefly taking a step back, looking at hydrogen more generally, although SAF and aviation can use biogenic feedstocks at first, the only long-term and large-scale SAF solution, as you've hinted to already, Nuala, is to produce it by combining hydrogen with captured carbon, known as power-to-liquid SAF or e-fuels. And from our perspective, and this is why we think SASHA is doing such great work, there's no viable path to zero carbon or climate neutral aviation that does not involve hydrogen on a large scale, whether in liquid form as a true zero carbon energy source, or as a key building block in the sustainable aviation fuels of the future. And you've mentioned the economic opportunity for the UK, and we've got a long and illustrious history within aerospace. We've got the right skills, some incredible research infrastructure, and crucially the right industrial and research base to meet the challenge. So thank you.
Sorry, great. Thank you, Scott. Excellent. Maybe we will switch a little bit up to shipping next. But this is really, I think, the core of SASHA is bringing these sectors together and kind of highlighting the overlap, especially in the potential kind of paths to producing the fuels. Though obviously the two sectors are also quite different in a number of ways. But Peter, why don't you tell us a bit more, and lovely to hear what you are up to.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I'm Peter Aylott, Director of Policy at UK Chamber of Shipping. First and foremost, in our strategic direction, the Chamber is decarbonisation, which all of our 210 members are completely committed to, and have been very pleased to see the direction of travel the IMO has taken in the last 12 months, setting out targets that align with what I think will deliver eventually the Paris goals. I think the challenge here, and I applaud you for bringing aviation and shipping together, because clearly collaboration is everything in this roadmap that we're pursuing, and so ideas need to cross-fertilise, and options and opportunities need to be seized. But I do think shipping has got a slightly different perspective to aviation in a couple of areas. One is political will. So shipping does have a reputation for being hugely international, and subsequently the political will or political footprint of that is a little bit diminished compared with aviation, which fundamentally generates the passenger recognition that we perhaps don't see in shipping in the same way. So that's one part. But the other part really is that the conundrum that Scott's just been describing of what are the solutions. Multifarious solutions are available in shipping. It is easier in some sectors to decarbonise than aviation, but just as challenging in other sectors to do it. And I think the Chamber's policy very clearly is that we are agnostic about fuel solutions, but we support certainly the aims of this organisation in saying green hydrogen is going to be a fundamental component of that. Now, it's interesting looking at where the energy needs to go, because very clearly if green hydrogen is used by shipping, we need a huge amount of energy. And that energy will then create a market scenario where hydrogen would be more expensive for other parts of industry. I think one of the challenges and fundamental challenges to the whole piece here is the source of electricity. To do all the work one would need to do to generate sufficient fuels for shipping, it needs an electrical capacity that I don't believe is in the national grid plan, renewable or otherwise. Going forward, and I think that needs a massive look at. So that's probably a theme that I'll pursue during the question and answers. And then finally, just to say that we also recognise the challenge of using transition fuels, which can offset and delay investment and direction into future fuels. Sometimes that is because of availability, what is available today in terms of propulsion of ships and in terms of supply chain. But I want to make very, very clear is that the Chamber, its members and the industry recognise the importance of measuring and understanding the life cycle analysis, so that we're not just putting the problems somewhere else. We want to get final solutions which deliver the targets we're trying to achieve. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Peter. And I definitely agree. I think that where the electricity comes from is a key question that I would love to delve into a little bit more. But last and definitely not least, let's turn to Maria, our final panelist from Aerospace Technology Institute. Maria, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, and thank you very much for having me. Maria Nelson, I'm Head of Innovation and Sustainability at the ATI, the Aerospace Technology Institute. For those who maybe don't know about us, we are a part government, part industry funded organization to support research and development in the aerospace sector. By aerospace, we mean development of aircraft components and technologies and everything that goes into the R&D for that. We're really here to support both the economic competitiveness of the sector. You saw, some of the direct jobs. There are a lot more indirect jobs. So this is a lot about the economic strength of the sector and the jobs and the GDP that drives that, as well as the sustainability, because we really think that one doesn't come without the other anymore anyway. And so we're doing a lot of work with sector stakeholders, and we've been really looking very intensely at the key drivers and the key enablers of decarbonization in the sector over the last 2-3 years. So maybe just a few of the highlights of the work that we're doing. One of the key things is a funding program that we offer, so an R&D grant funding program. We help aerospace industry develop their applications and hopefully gain access to funding. And we're seeing a lot of different technologies being developed, both in the fuel cell space, but also in hydrogen propulsion. So that's really great to see that coming through. We also do strategic research into the direction of the sector. So we have roadmaps to look at technology development and what's needed over the next decades to drive those two goals of economic competitiveness and sustainability/decarbonization. But we've done a few really interesting projects over the last years, are still doing one, and I'm just going to highlight two. So a couple of years ago, we did Fly Zero, which was a project that included 100 secondees from across the aerospace sector, so from many, many businesses in the UK aerospace sector, to look at the most viable fuel for larger aircraft. So we have, as an organization, a scope across different platforms, different types of aircraft. But in terms of both the pressing need to decarbonize and the economic opportunity, actually 95% and upward of both is in larger aircraft, so narrow body, mid-sized, wide body. And so that's really important to remember. It's really exciting to see the work, say, that Scott and his team are doing, and those scaling up opportunities are going to be really, really critical, as well as how do we actually address the bigger aircraft? How do we use maybe the smaller aircraft as trial grounds, testing grounds, and then also scale that up? And so that project, Fly Zero, looked at the most viable fuel, and in short, it was a year worth of work with 100 secondees. But in short, liquid hydrogen really is, we think, the most viable candidate for larger long-haul aircraft. And off the back of that, we then started looking at, okay, what can we do in order to start putting those enablers in place? And the follow-on project, and I'll post a link in a minute, but we are in the midst of a follow-on project from that, which is the HC and the Hydrogen Capability Network. So we took some of the recommendations of the first project and then thought, okay, so what needs to be put in place? And there's a report that's, I think, just about to come out actually from that, with 3 key recommendations, which is building test infrastructure, because obviously the fuel itself and the fuel value chain is, a significant challenge. In parallel, if we're moving to hydrogen being used on aircraft, and especially liquid hydrogen, well, any kind of hydrogen, we're looking at fundamental redesign of aircraft architectures. So, a shift that the sector has not seen in that at that scale. And so what can we do in order to accelerate that? And one of the things that we need to start looking at is test infrastructure, because we're really starting from clean sheet design. So how can we help sector players to move ahead with that? The other one is skills. So we do need to, and there's also maybe a big opportunity for cross-sector collaboration there. How do we build cryogenic skills and hydrogen fuel system skills? And there will be opportunities to learn from other adjacent sectors. Peter, maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then we also need fundamental research. So in the case of hydrogen, into cryogenic materials and handling of cryogenic materials and development of cryogenic materials. So those are some of the projects that we're doing in parallel. Just to plug that here, not for plugging, but hopefully there might be some people in the room who might be interested. We have an initiative called the ATI Hub, where we're looking to bring together that emerging ecosystem of suppliers and buyers, adopters of advanced new sustainable aircraft systems and aerospace technologies, because it is a lot about the technologies themselves and the development of those, but it's also about collaborating and working together in different ways, maybe branching out a bit to look at what are other sectors doing, finding more agile, kind of more rapid approaches to trialing things, to finding new collaborators, and also access to knowledge. So I'm really pleased to be here today, and also just want to point people at some other sessions and workshops and clinics and showcases and those kinds of things that we're offering, really to bring together players, either those who are already in the sector, but actually also companies who are maybe not yet in the aerospace sector or just starting out in the sector, as startups, spin-outs from university, or companies in adjacent sectors who might say, we might have a technology, we might have a solution that might work for aerospace as well, but we're not quite sure how to get in. The hub is a really good first step to do that. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Excellent. And we're very happy for everyone to plug anything they want in the chat, etc. And a reminder to everyone watching, feel free to put in questions in the Q&A, and we can see if we can get to them, or as many as we can get to. But yeah, so now we are moving into our kind of discussion section. And I just want to take a moment to just frame it a little bit more, maybe, because we did have last week the SAF mandate announcement and potential price stability mechanism consultation from the UK government on the aviation side. We are awaiting a new updated clean maritime plan, hopefully soon, on the shipping side. I hear it's coming in spring, and we are rapidly running out of spring, so we'll see. But one of the other things maybe to just highlight, on Friday, the UK court said that the current government's plan on net zero, rather than jet zero, net zero, was insufficient, and the government has to go and redo it. That actually includes international aviation and shipping. Now, there is a separate challenge to the jet zero challenge as well, that we'll see how that goes through the courts. But I think the point is more that at the moment we don't have clear full decarbonisation pathways from the government on either aviation or shipping. And I guess as I sit in Opportunity Green, the Secretariat to SASHA, we also have a legal team and follow those developments quite closely. So it'd be remiss of me not to kind of mention it, because I think what we will see is more and more pressure on the government to bring out more and more policy. So maybe we could just start with, I guess, and we've heard a little bit already, where we are in terms of the policy, and maybe if each of the panelists has one or two things that they think actually are really missing from the current policy landscape in the UK. It is an election year, so hopefully this will be the chance to plug for the next government to maybe put those in place. And I appreciate you may not have clear policy positions, but if there are areas that you think the government can support on, or if you want to just pass on that question, that's totally fine. Maybe Scott, I could start with you if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So one or two. So I suppose one would be targets. The importance of targets and government intervention to accelerate progress, and ultimately, in turn, drive investment. So I'd say, as a basic point, targets are essential to maintain focus and help sustain the momentum that is required to reach aviation's environmental goals. Hugely encouraging that, well, it was 18 months ago that ICAO introduced the long-term global aspirational target of net zero emissions by 2050. But it's worth pointing that some nations are choosing to get to set even more challenging ones. Take, for example, the US states of California and Hawaii, both of which require net zero to be reached by 2045 and not 2050. And for aviation, Norway in particular has a target of zero emissions internal flights by 2040. And closer to home, the UK government will consult next year on a target for domestic flights to reach net zero by 2040. I think that's really important. The targets clearly demonstrate the commitment to decarbonise aviation and have an important signalling effect in driving industry and the associated investment, private investment that is required to accelerate sustainability research. I guess a specific opportunity that we think could be good to kickstart the zero emissions flight here in the UK would be to use public service obligation routes. So some of those routes, are subsidised by the government. Potentially, state subsidy could be used on some of those routes where we are introducing our product. So, for example, we're working with Loganair in Scotland and Skybus, the Isles of Scilly in the southwest, to introduce our hydrogen fuel cell propulsion system on their Britain Northern Islanders. Some of those flights could be supported by public service obligation funding. And then just briefly, another point is funding for industrialization. So industrialization or commercialization, the technology that we have developed. I mean, you know, the lesson was once that we should leave it to the market, but that's obviously a lesson for a less urgent time. We cannot avoid the challenge of choosing our energy future. And you know, we think that today there's a growing consensus that the UK needs a very robust industrial strategy in order to compete on a global stage. And you can see it reflected in the interests of you know, both the left with mission-orientated industrial policy, or even on the right with defensive industrial policy. But what we would like is to see more ambition on how you take new products, new things that are going through the initial stages of R&D, and how can you help those to become commercialized. Aviation historically hasn't had the same level of support that, say, for example, the automotive industry has with the Automotive Transformation Fund. So we think there's definitely more support that could be provided to not just, you know, companies like us, but you know, you've got another member doing some great things in the form of Zero Avia. You've got Vertical Aerospace. You know, we're all pursuing zero emissions flight, but there will come a challenge when it comes to thinking about the capital costs of actually manufacturing the product that we've developed.
Great, thank you. Maria, were you waiting to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Thank you, Scott. I agree with a lot that you just said, Scott. I think there is really a lot of need for clarity, and I think that's what we hope for from government, you know, to continue to give clarity and, as you said, sort of signals as a signaling function. We think from a technology perspective, you know, it requires a lot of work, but we think it's feasible, right? The question is less a question of technology development, probably a more question of risk, of investment risk, because as you said, there are various paths to decarbonizing. So there's all need hydrogen, or most need hydrogen anyway at scale. But if we look at it from an airframe provider, you could look at SAF and scaling up SAFs, which has a different technology requirement on the aircraft, and hydrogen directly, which has a different requirement, completely different requirement in terms of technology development for aircraft. And all of that is an upstream kind of risk management question: is will there be infrastructure? Will there be energy at source? Anyway, that, you know, that remains the same. But the SAF infrastructure versus hydrogen, to actually use hydrogen directly as a fuel would kind of require different infrastructure, different fuels, different price mechanisms potentially. So if we're looking sort of how do you decide where to move and where to focus your investment at the moment, it's really a question of risk, and what we really need is clarity, and I think mutual clarity as well. So we're doing a lot of work in terms of research, I think along the lines, Peter, of what you just mentioned, to be really clear on what do we think is needed for one pathway, for the other pathway, you know, how much energy, how much fuel, what kind of infrastructure development to, as individual sectors, to be able to communicate our needs very clearly. But what we then need to do is to come together and say, okay, well, what does that then look like? If, say, in this instance, aviation has this need, shipping has that need, what does that aggregate up to? And there are other sectors as well. And obviously, there's also competition for hydrogen outside of our two sectors as well. So, you know, that's a lot of the work that you're doing, Aoife, I guess, is to argue for the harder to decarbonize sectors, which makes a lot of sense. But we would really, I think, appreciate a continued clarity and increasing clarity as well, in order for the sector to have confidence to make those investments, that the fuels, you know, will be there, that there's work ongoing and investment in infrastructure and so on for those fuels, so that the sector can make, you know, sensible investment decisions.
Right. Peter, do you want to say anything on the shipping side on that question?
Thank you very much. You know, I think I agree with the sentiments of both those views. I think there's a degree of realism required. I mean, the targets are set. I recognise that some countries want to go earlier, but we also know that some very major countries have got targets that are later than 2050. So there has to be some realism in the direction of travel. Just to give you sort of 2 or 3 examples of the challenges we see on a day-to-day basis that are particularly frustrating in terms of not. This is not a poke at the government. This is just a recognition of frustration of trying to deliver these outcomes. We could electrify now the short straits between Dover and Calais. We could electrify almost all the islands around the United Kingdom that have shipping services. We could do that now if we had supply of electricity. But we can't, because if we do, places like Southampton, Canterbury, would go dark. They would literally be blacked out by the demand that ships need on not on a continuous basis. And this is the challenge. Ships come in, they need a feed for a short time, and then they proceed. And clearly hydrogen is a solution here, and it's a very effective solution. But we are tending to treat this in a sort of a series approach rather than a parallel approach. And I mean, this is one area where I think aviation and shipping can collaborate. And Maria's already mentioned this. When we're talking about using hydrogen in a port like Dover that is next to a market town, you know, safety immediately becomes a concern, whether that hydrogen is carried as ammonia, whether that hydrogen is carried in a cryogenic form. And consequently, you know, what is being done at the moment in terms of skills, understanding, training, and competency to operate these systems on a bunkering basis, as we call it in shipping, a refuel basis, or an emergency basis. We're already in a situation where if we had a car carrier full of electric vehicles that had a problem, i.e. a fire, that vessel would have to anchor off outside because it'd be terrifically unsafe for it to come alongside. Now, I'm not saying hydrogen brings that same danger, but what I'm saying is that there are a lot of things we could be doing now to prepare for that situation when we're using hydrogen. And I think we're slow on that uptake. And that's something that's relatively quick without a huge amount of investment. As far as the investment concern in the particular fuel supply system is concerned, the break point or the area where the red line is between the fuel supply and the vessel. We're already producing ships that have hydrogen engine capability. We're also already producing ships that have ammonia engine capability. The first one will be working next year. And some of those scenarios are where you might carry ammonia as the feedstock, but actually the fuel you burn is hydrogen for the reasons that everyone has described. Now, I think on this piece, we've got to somehow remove that red line, because at the moment that is a problem in terms of investment. We already have a banking system in Europe that is, and the world, that is recognizing the need to tighten the cogwheel on where investment is going towards green technology and where investment isn't. And so it's becoming more and more difficult to access investment finance if there isn't a green component to it. We see that across every industry, not just the shipping and aviation, but I think that's already happening. And that's a good direction of travel. We know the requirements on public listed companies. But I think the piece that is missing is you buy a ship, how are you going to fuel it? And this is the red line that's a problem, is that we don't join up the supply as well as the demand. And that's somewhere the government, I think, could look at and come in with a means of collaborating and a means of recognizing, as Scott was talking earlier, about a plan that enables us to invest from an infrastructure perspective, not a pure buying a ship perspective, into a place where we can take this forward. Because as I said earlier, when I was talking about electrification, some of these solutions are already here. But we're not able to, you know, a shipping company can't invest in infrastructure in a national grid system, for instance. And these are the challenges. And this is where the government, I think, needs to focus. If you could bring those two together, then I think we can move, investment will happen and the ships will be built, because I think we're pretty clear in the shipping industry where the technology is. It's just which option are you going to pursue? And that will depend upon the infrastructure. Thank you.
Right. I mean, I think we're hearing very clearly there that there's one or two things that kind of everyone would want. And I think the industrialization policy is definitely one of them. I guess industrialization, infrastructure, and how do we do that in a sensible, clear way that gives actual, I guess, investment clarity for the entire sector. And that's not just the sector in terms of, as you point out, Peter, those that are buying the ships, but the broader ports, airports, etc. And maybe then just to bring in some of the questions that are coming in. And there's one here about competition for hydrogen-based fuels and how, I mean, they specifically ask about how shipping will be able to compete with road transport for those fuels. But I think we could also say that for aviation at the moment. I think, you know, in terms of passengers, we've all become very used to quite cheap flights, and that may not be the case with future fuels. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else the panelists wanted to add on how we are actually going to finance this, and how the two sectors are really going to make sure that they have access to these future fuels when there are multiple sectors competing for them. Does anyone want to take that?
Can I go first on this one? I think it's just to reflect on a couple of things. The first one is shipping has always burnt the fuel that no one else uses. So at the moment, we're burning the heavy oil that no other industry would touch. They'd need a more refined product. And that's very clearly the same. You know, the same. Aviation has a refined product. We don't. I think the other point, though, is that when we're talking about hydrogen as the solution, again, we won't be buying. I don't think there are going to be a huge number of cryogenic hydrogen vessels in the world. I appreciate you see hydrogen as being the fuel solution, but we won't be carrying it as hydrogen, I don't think. I think eventually, if we're operating those types of vessels, we'll be carrying ammonia. So that creates a subtly different approach to the solution compared with fuel cell technology or road or even rail. And I think I started off my whole gambit by saying there is some politics here, and shipping doesn't attract votes. Airline industry does, road and rail certainly do. People aren't going to make political decisions with shipping at the forefront of it, other than a lifeline service or a critical supply chain. So I think the political impetus is not going to be with shipping. So we will end up having to go to those areas where the solutions will be based on things that other people don't touch. And we already see that. You know, the Climate Change Committee has already stated that difficult to abate sectors should not be using biofuels. And so everything in the CMP, I suspect, will disinclude biofuels as a solution for shipping. I'm almost certain that's going to be the case. And clearly, from our perspective, we have a problem with that because we see solutions on those types of fuels metamorphosizing into e-fuels in the future, which don't have the same risks associated with biofuels from unsustainable sources. So I think the upshot here is shipping will find the right solution. I don't think we're going to see a huge uptake in cryogenic carried hydrogen in shipping. A number of reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons is other people need it first. But what I do think is that we will be using hydrogen in some shape or form as the direct energy transfer to propulsion. Thank you.
Yeah, if I might come in, if that's okay. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Peter said there. Taking a step back, I think if there's too much delay on deciding the use cases for green hydrogen, then that makes us, the UK, vulnerable to losing our position as a green leader. I'd say that, yeah, of course, we want to be agnostic to an extent at this stage, and that we don't want to rule out any technological pathways, but where the evidence begins to weigh itself to a certain point where actually trying to keep everything on the table is disruptive and a waste of taxpayers' money, we've got to come up with a better framework rather than just waiting for vested lobby interests to help decide the path of action. So home heating being an example, and the hydrogen use there. I think we almost need a new Treasury Green Book when it comes to net zero innovation, because at some point we're going to have to say, close in on certain technologies and say, to some, you know, I'm sorry, but you've had enough time to make your case, but you simply haven't made it. And so, you know, what does not exist is a government statement of the merit order for hydrogen and hydrogen demand, and what application sectors should get hydrogen before others, and therefore policy support. And crucially, what sectors should not get any hydrogen.
So I was going to come in on a few questions here as well, building on to Peter and Scott, what you've said, but I think a lot around it, this topic revolves around the economic opportunity as well. And I can just speak about the aerospace sector, right? But for people asking about the economic opportunity, we see a 34 billion market by 2050, of which we think the UK could actually up its market share from currently around 13% to about 18% if we develop leading hydrogen aircraft capability, hydrogen technology aircraft capability. So there's a huge market opportunity. And what does that mean? It means jobs, right? It means jobs for people across the country, better than average paid jobs. And you know, it means really the future, sort of economically, socially. So there's a huge opportunity there. Maybe something also around the challenges of decision making at the moment, maybe to clarify that a little bit for people who might have maybe a little bit less of an aviation and aerospace background. The challenge is, and that may be similar, Peter, or possibly slightly different in shipping, but the challenge is we need to decarbonize as soon as possible, as well as long term. And the answers to these two things are not necessarily the same. So as soon as possible is, you know, using whatever fuels are available. Obviously, there are biofuels available now, but at an incredibly small rate, and we think that's never actually going to scale to the level of what's required. But it is available now, and it is more straightforward to integrate with existing aircraft technologies. Then there's, as we were saying earlier, e-fuels or power to liquid fuels, same thing. They emit the same level of CO2. By the way, there was a question earlier. So in terms of CO2, there's no difference. But the scalability, in theory, is much bigger if the feedstock, if the energy, the upstream feedstock is available. The challenge with biofeedstock is that either in the UK we're focused on waste feedstocks, which at some point won't scale anymore, or if you move away from waste, which we're not doing, and rightly so, I think, in the UK at the moment, but if we did, as other countries are doing, at some point you sort of hit other sustainability problems because you're competing with agriculture, basically, with food production, and there are other issues like water and pesticides and other things, basically, so land mass issues. So which means in terms of scalability, we want to focus on e-fuels and on synthetic fuels, which then need hydrogen as well. And then the next point is, well, if you're using hydrogen to generate a different fuel, it is more effective to then use the hydrogen directly. But that means that you need fundamentally different aircraft, which need investment now. And that's a lot of what we're doing. But, you know, we need to continue to do that and do more of it, because the development life cycles for aircraft can be about 15 years. And then aircraft stay in operation for about 30. So if you add that up, that's a very long life cycle. And that's, you know, different potentially. I don't know, Peter, you'll be able to elucidate, but different from shipping, potentially definitely different from, say, the automotive sector. The cycle is so much slower, which means we need to make decisions now for, you know, a very, very long time. But also we need to decarbonize what's flying now, because what are we going to do? It's unlikely that all of the aircraft operating now, everything will just be grounded and replaced. And even if in a kind of theoretical experiment that were an option, we can't scale up that quickly with aircraft production to replace. So we, you know, there are different demands, basically conflicting demands. And that's where some level of that challenge is coming from, that we need to do something now, but we also need to do something for the future. And then the other point just around economic competitiveness, is that it's obviously both of our sectors are incredibly internationally complex and networked and interlaced. And so some of the challenge is international alignment, because nobody really wants to create a position that might disadvantage certain sectors by being, you know, less enabling and less supporting of innovation. And in aviation specifically, just as an example, if some of the carbon mandates might be higher in the UK, it's very easy for airlines to go and get fuel elsewhere where carbon mandates might be lower. So it's a very easy thing to circumnavigate, basically circumvent. And so in order to actually drive the sector forward, but also to jointly move forward and actually create this innovation space where everybody benefits, because in those new innovation spaces, players can only benefit if we all benefit. There's not one player benefiting. Either the ecosystem benefits and we move forward, or, you know, a whole number of players don't benefit. But it requires that international alignment on the political at the political level, in order for one nation not to kind of go one way and another one or another kind of region to go another way. The other challenge that might pose is just a pure operational challenge. So if aircraft fly from one place to the other and one fuel is available here but not available elsewhere, then that just also becomes a very operational, down-to-earth operational challenge. So that's just a bit of context in terms of both the size of the opportunity, but also some of the complex issues that we need to continue resolving together in order to have more clarity and to really move forward together.
Yeah, I think you've set that out really, really well. And aware we're not getting to all of the questions in the Q&A, but just we are in the last 10 minutes already, which has flown by. I think we could continue talking for a long time, but maybe I could just quickly ask each panelist just to wrap up with just what do they think, or maybe what are they hopeful for in the next maybe year or two in the UK? Because obviously this is an election year, and while we can't predict what will happen, I think we could be pretty confident there will be a change in government, but interested in if the panels have particular hopes for that change and what they might see. Who wants to take that first?
I'll go first, if that's all right. Just
Sure.
But because one thing that was on my mind is policy is definitely going to be very important, and as we said, signaling and targets and so on. It's not just that. I think it's also around industry coming together, and I do think there's a responsibility, on us and an opportunity on us as industry. And I think I'm really optimistic because over the last few years we have seen a lot of development there, both in terms of discourse, but also in terms of awareness, in terms of what players are looking at, planning, developing. As I said, some of the research projects that are coming through. If we look even just 3-4 years back, sustainability was a little bit of a fringe topic, and it is now really at the forefront. As we said, it goes hand in hand with economic competitiveness. So that's been a huge shift, and obviously we need to continue down that path, and we need to continue, to actually develop and implement all of those technologies. But I guess what we're hoping for is for continuing alignment across industry and also in adjacent industries, Peter, so this is a great conversation to have, to start getting clarity, mutual clarity as well, of what adjacent sectors that might have similar or related needs are doing. And then I do think continued clarity and support from government into R&D investment and into really reaping that huge opportunity that is, a sustainability need, but also an economic opportunity for us.
And I'd say, I think we need to see a merit order for the use of green hydrogen. And I think I'm fairly confident that aviation will feature quite highly, not just because of its importance with SAF, but because it is a genuine fuel of the future for very specific applications. I noticed there was one of the questions there was interaction with the Labour Party, and both as a company, we've had direct interactions, but also under the Aerospace Trade Association ADS, and I think they've demonstrated a real interest in the role that hydrogen can play. So we feel very encouraged by that direction of travel.
Shall I go next? I think I support what both Scott and Maria have said, but from a shipping perspective, and recognising where we are and what we need in terms of the future of shipping, I think an industry strategy that recognises both Scott's point about where the merit order is, but the similar for other fuel types and other fuel solutions. I think we're desperate, Aoife, to see a clean maritime plan, whether it's called a decarbonisation plan, whatever it is. There is nothing now since 2019. And as everyone has said on this call, things have changed markedly in the last 5 years. So we need to see something there. And then finally, I think really it's electrical capacity for the United Kingdom, because I think that is the most important thing. The number of technologies we have in shipping that are TRL level 5 to 8 that could be scaled up very quickly. Some are at a very small scale, but nothing big. And that's all because there just simply isn't electrical capacity in this country to deliver solutions like that. So I think they're the takeaways that I would be looking at if I was sitting in front of the future shipping minister. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all. And maybe just as a kind of final wrap up thoughts from me. I mean, I think we've had a super interesting discussion. I think a number of crossovers of shipping and aviation have been highlighted, and we didn't really get all that much time necessarily to dig into them. But yeah, as Peter said there, finally, the capacity on electricity is going to be key to all of this. A merit order of hydrogen is definitely something the SASHA Coalition is very interested in engaging on, and also for fuels, because we do really believe green hydrogen is definitely one of the fuels, but also all of those fuels derived from green hydrogen. So whether that is methanol or ammonia or e-kerosene for aviation, there's a number of different options there, but green hydrogen is really the fundamental, and even more fundamental than that is, of course, the electricity, as just said. Yeah, I mean, I hope this has been a really interesting discussion. Apologies to those who had questions that we didn't quite get to. We've taken note of them, and we're going to do a small kind of wrap-up piece, and we'll post this on our website. But hopefully some of those future either parts of government or civil servants are listening, and we can have that kind of combined message to them, because it really does seem like at this stage, what we really need is cross-departmentalized, I can't even say it, across departments in the UK government. We need them to work together, both on shipping and aviation and hydrogen, rather than individually and potentially sending some memos back and forth. But yes, we will see, I guess, how the different policies announced on aviation last week kind of play out. We will be keeping our eye out for the Clean Maritime Plan as eagerly as Peter is. And then also, you know, again, just to think about what is going to happen more broadly on the net zero pathway for the country. Because while we're trying to bring shipping and aviation together, it is a much broader question, and that plays into those things around the skills as well that we didn't really dig into very much, but Maria mentioned. So yeah, absolutely lots there. And just basically to say thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to our excellent panelists for all of your insights and thoughts and time. And I really hope it was useful for everyone. And yeah, we'll send out a link if anyone wants to watch it back, or for anyone who missed it. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Aoife.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, everyone.